Kang Min-ho's hand tightened around the gun before he even saw her. Rain hammered the alley behind the Seoul docks, and there, pressed into a stack of soaked cardboard, a small shape flinched away from the flashlight. Not a rat, not a threat. A child. Maybe 6 years old, ribs visible through a torn shirt, eyes huge with a fear that had nothing to do with the storm. 3 of his men stood behind him, guns still smoking from the deal that had just gone wrong 2 streets over. Blood on his knuckles. A body cooling somewhere behind them. And now this, a girl who had seen too much, hiding in the one place she thought no one would look. He should have walked away. Men like him did not stop for lost children. Men like him did not have room in their chest for anything that could be used against them later. But she looked up at him, and instead of screaming, she whispered one word: please. Welcome to Afro-Korean romance, where love has no borders. If you believe in love, please like, share, and subscribe for more Afro-Korean romance stories, and stay with us, because what happens in the next hour will change how you see family, loyalty, and forgiveness forever. 20 years is a long time to keep a secret. Long enough for a girl to become a woman. Long enough for a criminal empire to rot quietly from the inside. Long enough for the people who loved each other most to forget how to say it out loud. But some things do not stay buried. Some truths climb out of the ground exactly when the world is not ready for them. What made a man capable of murder kneel in the rain for a stranger's child? What did that little girl carry inside her all these years that no one, not even the man who raised her, ever fully understood? And when she finally stood in a courtroom, staring across at the only father she had ever known, what truth would she choose to speak? Stay close. Because nothing about this story is what it seems before the docs. Before the blood, before any of it, there had been a different kind of boy. Min-ho was not born into darkness. He was born into a small apartment in Incheon that smelled of his mother's soup and his father's cheap cigarettes, in a family that had nothing but each other. His father worked the fish markets until his back gave out. His mother cleaned houses she could never afford to live in. And Min-ho, the oldest of 3, learned early that the world did not care how hard you worked if you were born poor. He was 14 when the loan sharks came for his father's debt. He was 15 when he watched 2 men beat his father in the street while neighbors watched from behind curtains, too afraid to help. He was 16 when his father died, not from the beating itself, but from the shame that followed it, a slow death of the spirit that took another year to finish the job on his body. That was the day Min-ho decided that fear was the only currency that mattered. If people feared him, they could not humiliate him. If people feared him, his family would never again stand in the street while the world looked away. He climbed. Not gently. He broke things, bones, promises, rules on his way up, and by the time he was 32, Kang Min-ho did not work for anyone. Men worked for him. The old debts that had crushed his father were nothing compared to the empire he now commanded, one that moved through shipping routes and back rooms and quiet threats delivered with a smile. He told himself it was justice. He told himself the boy who watched his father die deserved a world where he could never be that powerless again. He never told himself he was lonely. Men like him were not allowed to be lonely. Loneliness was a luxury for people who had not paid the price he'd paid. Then one wet night behind the docks, a little girl looked up at him and said please, and something in his chest, something he thought had died with his father, cracked open. Her name, she told him through chattering teeth, was Akka. She did not know her last name. She did not know where her mother had gone, only that one day the door of a rented room did not open again, and a neighbor put her out onto the street rather than feed another mouth. She had been living behind the docks for 3 weeks, stealing bread, sleeping in the gaps between shipping containers, learning the way children do when the world fails them to make herself small enough not to be noticed. Min-ho's men waited for the order: leave her. Or worse, she had seen a killing, and men like them did not leave witnesses, not even 6-year-old ones. Boss, one of them said carefully, you know what needs to happen. Min-ho looked at the girl. She had stopped shaking. She was watching him now with the strange, ancient calm of a child who has already survived more than most adults ever will, waiting to see what kind of man he was going to be. Her a blanket, he said, and find out if she's eaten today. Men exchanged looks they did not dare voice. That night Kang Min-ho, a man the police called a monster, a man whose name alone made grown criminals go quiet in restaurants, carried a 6-year-old girl into his home and told his housekeeper to prepare a room. He did not know that night that he had just made the only decision of his life he would never regret. The house did not know what to do with a child at first. Min-ho's estate on the hillside above the city was built for intimidation, not comfort. Marble floors that echoed, guards who did not smile, silence so heavy it pressed on the ears. Akka moved through it like a small ghost for the first weeks, flinching at doors, hoarding bread in her pockets out of habit, sleeping on the floor beside her bed because the mattress felt like something that could be taken away from her at any moment. Min-ho watched all of this from a distance, unsure how to close it. He had raised no one. He had loved no one, not since his mother passed quietly a few years after his father, worn down by grief that outlasted her health. He knew how to make men fear him. He did not know how to make a child feel safe. It was his housekeeper, Mrs. Yoon, who finally sat him down in his study one evening. She is not afraid of you, Mrs. Yoon said. She is afraid that you will change your mind. I won't. Then show her, not with money, not with guards, sit with her. Eat with her, let her see your face when you are not deciding whether someone lives or dies. It was the first time in 15 years anyone had spoken to Kang Min-ho like that and lived to see the next morning unbothered. He did not punish her for it. He listened. The next evening, instead of eating alone in his study surrounded by reports and ledgers, he sat at the small kitchen table across from Akka, who stared at her rice as though it might vanish if she looked away. You don't have to hide food anymore, he said quietly. There will always be more tomorrow. She looked up at him, testing the words the way a burned child tests a stove. Promise, something about the way she said it, small, brave, terrified, undid something in him completely. Promise. It was the first promise Kang Min-ho had made in 20 years that he intended to keep no matter what it cost him. She began to call him Appa within the year, not because he asked her to. Because one morning, running down the hallway to show him a drawing of a house with 3 stick figures in front of it, her, him, and Mrs. Yoon, she simply said it as easily as breathing. Appa, look. The guards in the hallway froze. No one called Kang Min-ho anything but boss, sir, or nothing at all. But he crouched down to her level, took the drawing in both hands like it was something precious enough to break, and said nothing for a long moment because his throat had closed around words he didn't trust himself to speak cleanly. It's beautiful, he finally managed. That drawing stayed in his desk drawer for the next 19 years. Even after it yellowed, even after everything that came later, the years that followed were not simple. Min-ho's world did not pause for fatherhood. There were meetings that ran until dawn, men who came to the house with bad news and worse intentions, nights when Akka woke to raised voices behind closed doors and learned not to ask questions, because some questions in this house were dangerous to both the asker and the answerer. But there were also mornings when he taught her to ride a bicycle in the estate's long driveway, running behind her with his suit jacket flapping, laughing in a way his men had never once heard. There were evenings when he sat with her over homework he barely understood, learning algebra at 40 because his daughter needed help and he refused to let her think there was anything he couldn't do for her. There were birthdays with cakes too large for the two of them to finish, candles blown out with wishes she never told him, though he always suspected, hoped, that at least one of them was for him to stay safe. He kept her away from the business as much as a man in his position could. She went to a private school under a different surname, guarded from a distance by men she believed were simply drivers. She grew up believing her father ran shipping companies. She was 15 before she understood, in fragments and overheard whispers, that the shipping companies were not the whole truth. By then it was too late to protect her from loving him anyway. She was 17 when she asked him directly, in the quiet of his study, the question he had been dreading since the night he carried her out of that alley. Are you a bad person? He did not lie to her. He had lied to judges, to rivals, to the police who had investigated him 3 times and found nothing they could prove. But he could not lie to the drawing in his desk drawer, to the girl who had trusted him with her whole small life when she had every reason not to. I have done bad things, he said slowly. For reasons I believed were good ones. I don't know if that makes me a bad person or just a man who made bad choices trying to survive a bad world. You ever hurt anyone who didn't deserve it? The question landed like a blade between his ribs because the honest answer was yes. Somewhere in 20 years of climbing there had been mistakes, collateral damage, people caught in currents they never chose to enter. Yes, he admitted, and I will carry that. But Akka, everything I built so that you would never have to make the choices I made. So that you would never stand in a street and watch someone you love be destroyed because the world decided your family didn't matter. She was quiet for a long time. Then she crossed the room and hugged him the way she had when she was 6 and terrified and hoping he would not send her away. I'm not scared of who you were, she whispered. I just needed you to be honest with me. He held her and thought, not for the first time, that this girl had a strength in her that even his enemies did not possess, the strength to look at the truth and choose love anyway. He did not know yet how much that strength would one day be tested. He did not know that the truth he had just admitted to her would, 20 years later, sit between them in a courtroom with far higher stakes than a teenage girl's trust. If this story already has your heart racing, comment I'm still watching, and let's see who makes it all the way to the end with us. Akka went to university in Seoul, then to law school on a scholarship she earned entirely on her own, refusing every offer Min-ho made to smooth the path for her. She wanted, she told him fiercely, to build something with her own hands that no one could say was bought. He respected that more than she ever knew. He had spent his whole life building an empire through force. Watching his daughter build a future through merit alone was, in a strange way, the proudest thing he had ever witnessed, proof that whatever darkness lived in him had not passed into her. She specialized, against all irony, in criminal law. Prosecution at first. She wanted to put away the men who preyed on the powerless the way her mother had once been preyed upon, the way she herself might have vanished into the underworld if a monster hadn't decided on one rainy night to be something else instead. Min-ho watched her graduate at the top of her class with a pride so large it embarrassed him. He sat in the audience in a suit that cost more than most people's cars and clapped until his hands ached, thinking of a 6-year-old with hollow cheeks who once hoarded bread in her pockets. He never imagined that her career, her convictions, her relentless pursuit of justice, the very qualities he had helped nurture in her, would one day place her directly across from him in a room where only one of them could walk away free. The unraveling began, as these things always do, with a name Min-ho thought he had buried decades earlier. A new prosecutor's office had been assembled specifically to take down organized crime networks that had operated untouched for a generation, task forces, wiretaps, informants turned by promises of reduced sentences. Slowly, patiently, evidence began to surface that connected Kang Min-ho's shipping empire not just to smuggling and extortion, but to a death nearly 25 years old, a death from the very night he had found Aka in that alley. The man he and his crew had killed that night had not been a nameless criminal, as Min-ho had always believed. He had a brother, and that brother had spent 2 decades quietly building a case, waiting for the day the statute of limitations technicalities would align and the political will would exist to finally bring Kang Min-ho to justice. That day arrived the same year Aka was appointed as a rising star. Long thought lost. Kang Min-ho was arrested on a Tuesday morning in his own driveway in front of the house where he had once taught a 6-year-old girl to ride a bicycle. Aka watched the footage on the news that evening from her apartment. Her father's face, older now, gray at the temples, dignified even in handcuffs, staring back at her from a screen. And she wept in a way she had not allowed herself to since she was small and afraid and alone behind the docks. She could have walked away from the entire ordeal. Resigned quietly. Let another prosecutor carry the case forward while she disappeared into private practice somewhere far from Seoul, far from the cameras that now hunted her family name like wolves. But something in her, the same something that had made her whisper please to a stranger in the rain 20 years earlier, trusting him against every instinct that told her the world was only cruel, refused to run. If she believed in justice, she had to believe in it completely. Even here, even now. Even when it cost her everything she loved, she just did not yet know what form that belief would take when it finally arrived in the courtroom. If this story is breaking your heart the way it's breaking ours, hit like right now, and let's see how many of you make it to the ending with us, because what happens next changes everything. The trial of Kang Min-ho became the most watched criminal case in Seoul in a decade. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Old rivals who had feared him for 20 years came forward now that his empire had crumbled, eager to testify against a man who could no longer touch them. The prosecution built a methodical case, decades of smuggling routes, extortion records, and at its center the murder from that rainy night behind the docks, the one crime with a name and a grieving brother still willing to fight for it after all these years. Min-ho's own lawyers advised him to fight everything to deny, to use every technicality the law allowed. He had the resources. He had even now connections that could make evidence disappear or witnesses reconsider their memories. He refused all of it. I did what I did, he told his lawyer flatly. I will not spend what's left of my life lying about it. Let the truth stand, whatever it costs me, his lawyer argued. His remaining allies argued. Even Mrs. Yoon, now elderly, visited him in detention and begged him to fight to think of Aka of what a guilty verdict would do to her career, her name, her future. She will survive whatever happens to me, Min-ho said quietly. She survived worse before I ever found her. What she cannot survive is watching me become the kind of man who lies his way out of the truth. I already made that choice once, the night I decided fear was the only currency worth having. I will not make it again in front of her. Watching from the sidelines as a private citizen now rather than a prosecutor, did not know about this conversation. She only knew that as the trial progressed, her father, a man capable of manipulating rooms full of hardened criminals, offered almost no defense at all. It confused her, it frightened her. And slowly, achingly, it began to look like something else entirely. It began to look like penance. The turning point came on the 17th day of testimony, when the prosecution called its final witness, a man named Ha Jun, the younger brother of the victim from 20 years earlier, the man whose decades of quiet investigation had finally cracked the case open. Ha Jun took the stand with the weathered dignity of someone who had waited half his life for this moment. He spoke of his brother, not a criminal, as the old rumors claimed, but a low-level dockworker who had stumbled into a deal gone wrong, an innocent man caught in violence that was never meant to touch him. The courtroom went utterly silent as he described finding his brother's body. As he described spending 20 years chasing a ghost of a name through underworld whispers, sacrificing his own career, his marriage, his health, for this single moment of accountability. Do not want revenge, Ha Jun said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. I want the truth acknowledged. I want to know that my brother's life mattered enough for someone to answer for taking it. Seated in the gallery among the public, felt something break loose in her chest. She had spent her whole life believing her father had saved her from the streets out of goodness alone. She had never once considered, had never let herself consider that the very night he found her might have been born from an act of violence against another family who had lost everything. Her mercy and her grief collided in that courtroom like two currents meeting in a storm. During recess she found Ha Jun alone in the hallway, and for the first time in the entire trial she spoke to him directly. I'm the girl he found that night, she said quietly, the daughter he raised. I need you to know I am not here to defend what he did. I am here because I do not know how to hold both truths at once, that he took your brother's life and that he gave me mine. Ha Jun studied her for a long moment, his eyes softening with a grief that had learned over 20 years how to make room for complexity. I have hated him for 2 decades, he said finally, but I never hated the idea that something good could come from something terrible. My brother would not have wanted a child to suffer in his memory. He was kind before the world made his death necessary to men like your father. Perhaps the only justice that matters now is not punishment alone but truth, full truth from everyone. It was a strange kind of grace, offered in a courthouse hallway between two people bound by a tragedy neither of them had chosen. And it planted in Aka's mind the seed of what she would do next, something no one, not even her father, saw coming on the day of closing arguments. Aka Kang requested and was granted the extraordinary right to address the court not as a prosecutor, for she had recused herself long ago, but as a character witness and as the daughter of the accused. The room fell into a hush usually reserved for verdicts, not testimonies. Reporters leaned forward. Min-ho, seated at the defense table in a plain prison uniform that could not erase 20 years of quiet dignity, looked up at his daughter with an expression of dread and love so tangled together that even the judge paused before nodding for her to begin. 20 years ago, Aka said, her voice trembling but clear, carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom, a 6-year-old girl was starving behind the docks of the city, hiding from a world that had already decided she did not matter. She had watched violence that night too, violence she did not understand, that she has spent her whole adult life trying to make sense of. She paused, gathering herself, aware that every word from here would be printed in tomorrow's headlines, dissected by strangers who had never known either version of the man on trial. That night a man capable of terrible things made one choice that was not terrible. He knelt in the rain for a stranger's child instead of walking away. He fed her. He raised her. He taught her that fear should never again decide whether she deserved safety, whether she deserved a future. Everything I am, my education, my career, my belief that the law exists to protect the powerless exists because that man chose in one moment to be more than the world had made him. She turned, finding Ha Jun in the gallery, holding his gaze with a steadiness she did not fully feel. Do not stand here to erase what he did to your family. Nothing I say can undo that loss, and I will not insult your brother's memory by pretending otherwise. But I stand here to say that people are not only the worst thing they have ever done. My father built an empire on fear because fear was the only shield he ever learned against a world that let his own father die in the street while neighbors watched and did nothing. He was wrong to choose violence. He has never once in 20 years denied that to me. Her voice broke just slightly before she steadied it again. But he also chose every single day since that night to build something different in me than what built him. He is guilty of the crime this court has heard testimony about. I will not ask you to excuse that. I only ask that whatever judgment this court delivers, it remembers that a man capable of destruction is also capable of redemption, and that redemption, however late, however incomplete, still matters. It mattered to a 6-year-old girl who might have died in an alley if he had made a different choice that night. It should matter to this court too. She sat down, The courtroom did not move for a long moment. Even the judge, a woman known for decades of unshakable composure, wiped her eyes discreetly before calling for recess. Min-ho, from his seat at the defense table, wept without shame for the first time in 20 years, not for himself, but for the woman his daughter had become, and for the truth she had just spoken with a courage that made his own choices, however dark, feel worth something after all. The verdict, when it came 3 days later, surprised no one and everyone at once. Guilty. Kang Min-ho was found guilty on the charges related to the murder 20 years prior. As well as several of the lesser organized crime charges the prosecution had built its case around. The law, as it should, did not bend for love or redemption alone. But in sentencing, the judge, citing Min-ho's full and voluntary confession, his refusal to fight the charges through the technicalities his resources could easily have purchased, and the extraordinary testimony of both his daughter and the victim's brother, handed down a sentence significantly reduced from what the prosecution had originally sought. Not freedom, not forgiveness the law could grant, but a measure of mercy the system rarely extended to men like him. This court, the judge said, cannot erase the harm you caused, but it can recognize that harm does not exist in isolation from context, and that a man's later choices, however imperfect, however insufficient to undo the past, are not without meaning. You will serve your sentence, and I hope in whatever years remain to you afterward you continue to be the father your daughter described in this courtroom, rather than the man you once believed you had to be. Min-ho did not speak as he was led from the courtroom. He only looked back once, finding Aka's eyes in the gallery, and mouthed 2 words that needed no sound to be understood. Thank you. 5 years later, Aka stood outside a modest apartment building in Seoul, holding a small cake with a single candle, waiting. The door opened. Kang Min-ho, older now, thinner, his hair fully gray, but his eyes carrying a peace she had never seen in him before, stood in the doorway of the small apartment he had moved into after his release. A life stripped of empire and fear and everything he had once believed he needed to survive. You didn't have to come, he said, though his voice caught with the same gratitude it always did when she appeared, as if some part of him still could not quite believe she chose him again and again after everything. I wanted to, she said, simply stepping inside. Happy birthday, Appa. He looked at the small cake, then at her, a woman now respected across Seoul not for her father's name but for her own relentless, fierce belief in justice tempered by mercy, a belief she had built from the wreckage of everything he had once been. I don't deserve this, he said quietly, the way he always did on days like this. Maybe not, Akka said, setting the cake down and lighting the candle. But you earned it anyway. That night in the rain, you didn't have to kneel down for me. You chose to. And every day since, you chose to keep being someone worth loving, even when it would have been easier not to try. He blew out the candle with a wish he never spoke aloud, though she suspected, as she always had, that it was the same one every year: gratitude, simply, for a second chance he never believed he deserved but had spent every year since trying to earn. Outside, the Seoul evening settled into a soft, ordinary quiet, no sirens, no danger, no fear waiting behind any door. Just a father and daughter sharing cake in a small apartment, having survived a story that could have ended so many darker ways, and chosen instead truth and mercy and love all the way to the end. Some loss, as she had once told him, is only the beginning of something greater. They had both learned that lesson the hardest way possible. And neither of them would ever take a single ordinary evening together for granted again. That's the story of Kang Min-ho and the daughter who saved him, not from prison, but from a lifetime of believing fear was the only thing keeping him safe. If this story touched your heart, you know what to do. Welcome to Afro-Korean romance, where love, passion, and emotional stories come to life. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next story of love strong enough to survive anything. We'll see you in the next one.